Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Avatar Bible study. Today, we are going to be discussing the episode that officially made this an anime. Of course, I'm referring to Book 3 and Episode 5, The Beach. And we're going to be discussing the role that parents have in our lives according to the Bible, which I think was illustrated quite wonderfully in today's episode. If you can turn to the book of Proverbs, chapter 20 and verse 7, we read this observation by King Solomon. The righteous man walks in his integrity. His children are blessed after him. So, noting this couplet, he's making a point through these two statements. A man who's right in his relationship with God, who actively models the character of God in his life, is not only walking in his integrity, meaning he doesn't hide aspects of who he is, the whole person, integrity, from the word integer. That's what's being put on display. And who benefits from this the most? His children. Now, how would the character, the completeness of someone's character, rather, in a right relationship with God, bless their kids? Or inversely, the lack of integrity, a flaw or a lacking in someone's ability to be righteous, lining up with God's character, would make his children cursed? Well, that's what we're going to discuss, because of all the types of relationships that are described in the Bible, none are treated with more severity than that of a child's relationship with their parents. In the Ten Commandments, there are 4 that are given concerning our relationship with God vertically, but also 6 that are given concerning our horizontal relationships with our fellow man. And that, of course, includes the first of which, involving our parents. Of all the titles that God himself reveals himself to us as, he chose, or the Spirit chose, to emphasize the Father and the Son as how we know him personally. So why all of this weight to the relationship that we have with our parents? Obviously, when it comes down to it, it's because, like we saw in today's episode, there are few relationships in this life that impact and shape who we are as people more profoundly than this. And in order to personalize this information in a way that we all can understand, I want to use today's episode as a template for how the Bible stresses the responsibility parents have to their children and how it ultimately points us to our definitions of heaven and hell. So, starting with the first point regarding parents and our impression of ourselves, I want to draw attention to Azula and the impact that her parents both, by the way, had concerning a lack. No matter how true the observation, the impact that Ursa had on her daughter was so severe that it became the framework that she sought to live up to. She couldn't help the fact that her father was a monster. He had made his own decisions in life. However, as the model she sought to emulate, she ended up being a daddy's little girl, and it wasn't pretty. What then happened when her mother, and this is key, solidified that in her mind? It not only hurt, but it became her only option. What do I mean? When, and this is key, without an alternative to evil being offered, instead of being like daddy and daddy alone, what if mom had instead, and this is again useless conjecture because the what if is not reality, but what if we had instead seen from Ursa an alternative rather than an affirmation of the evil growing inside of her? Or if you don't like the evil, which I don't see why you wouldn't, Azula's scary, but more of her father in her than her mother, who undoubtedly was a better human being. The reason is because not only when she affirmed it, she didn't present anything instead of it. The only other example she had in her life of how to behave or who to live up to, the person who she was closest to apart from her father, would have been her mother. But instead of showing an alternate example, what did we see? An agreement, an affirmation, saying that is the only choice that you have because I haven't presented another one. And this is what's key. When we're talking about this, the error for Ursa as a parent, and we'll acknowledge that, was there was truth, but no grace. Half the picture. Remember our opening passage regarding integrity is an incomplete picture. And again, we're not going to shame necessarily Ursa for her flaws as a parent, but if she had been a perfect parent, what would that have looked like? Well, in the book of John, chapter 1 and verse 14, when describing Jesus coming to this world, there's an interesting description given of what we saw, because the conjoining passages note that no one has seen the Father at any time, but the Son has revealed him to us. So if we get a clearer picture of what God is like based on who Jesus was, what did we see that made it so clear what the perfect parent looked like? Well, in John chapter 1 and verse 14, it says, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." So the Word, emphasized as God, was the one who became flesh. This is describing Jesus. "And we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father," note this, "full of grace and truth." Not not some grace, but mostly truth. Both. And for those who aren't familiar, grace just means beautiful or good by nature. Examples of this in Greek culture, for instance, would be doing something well, like a graceful dancer, or handling something gently and properly. That was very gracious of you, the way you handled that. So, noting that a gracious parent would be one that's forgiving, it would also, notice not instead of, but also be appropriate for there also to be truth concerning the severity of their children's actions. And we refer to this as discipline. They need to learn from their mistakes. That's truth. But also grace in noting there's restoration. There's a preservation of relationships. There's something better to look for than just the fact you made a mistake, which is, of course, important as well as a parent. In Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 24, we read, "He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly." And this is the point of emphasis. Parents naturally want to love their children because of the original model. He is love by nature, and love includes both discipline and grace. Ozai's impact on Azula was without any discipline towards her sadism, and it thrived. Ursa's impact on Azula was without any grace, and it solidified her corruption. So we have no truth and no grace, no discipline and no forgiveness. And in the end, Azula ultimately ended up never seeing the image of God in her parents. And it showed, because we didn't see a lot of the image of God in her. We saw the image of not God, which is the definition of evil. So note that point, a lack of involvement as parents, as the Bible defines it, was what ultimately shaped Azula's character as the very scary villainess that we know her to be. Now, again, I'm not saying that it was all her parents' fault, but I'm emphasizing the severity of how much of an impact that her parents' inaction had on her. But in mentioning discipline, and especially in regards to corporal punishment, which is what Proverbs 13 was describing, I'm sure you're all wondering, oh yeah, but what about too much discipline or too much truth? I mean, obviously Ursa was too honest, but what if, for example, you note the too much discipline given by Ozai? That's what brings us to our next topic. Parents and our understanding of value. That, of course, would be illustrated by Zuko and Ty Lee. Whereas Azula is a case of seeing none of the attributes of God in her parents, Zuko and Ty Lee saw too much of one over the other. And understand as well, the goal of any relationship is and should be to point the person to the original model. So if we saw discipline done apart from the way God does it, that would be misuse, or, as we would rightly acknowledge it, abuse. There's a right and a wrong way to treat anything, even in a disciplinary action. And when you go too far, the only reason we say you go too far is because there's a limit. for how you ought to do something rightly. There needs to be grace, right? Not just truth. But when that too far is established, we usually think, oh, well, the government, the law decides it. Yeah, but who gave the government that law? Who's the metric by which we judge whether a law is just or not? Because when the government says you shouldn't discipline your parents at all, or they say if your child steps out of line once, you take them out in the backyard and shoot them, when do we say that's not right? Because there is, in fact, a wrong way to do something. And we saw it with Ozai. Because in his act of discipline, the truth was shown to Zuko that he was being disrespectful. That's what happened. But how it happened was another matter entirely. He received a lifelong scar that was a lesson he remembered. But the question isn't just that a lesson was taught, it was, how did the lesson impact him? What did it produce? And the answer isn't a passing grade. Did it give him, and this is the ideal, what is discipline meant to be biblically? We'll go into the scriptural support for this in a moment. If you want to read ahead while I'm talking, Hebrews chapter 12 and verses 3 onward. But you ask, what is the purpose of discipline? Is it to just address the behavior, or is it to give them a new direction in life? Is it to properly explain to them that this is not okay? Is it a proper exercise of a father's authority in the home as ultimately a model of the character of God, just like the mother? But you ask the questions, did it give Zuko a greater admiration of his father's power? Because as Proverbs says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And if you fear your parents, not in a timorous way, but in the sense that I see someone as over authority to me, and I don't want to do the things that break their heart or anger them, because there's a reason they get upset by those things. I know they love me. And so if they get angry at the things that I'm doing, I should process that as, now wait a minute, what was addressed by Ozai? Not the fact that Zuko was, in fact, in the wrong. And not even necessarily that Ozai was more powerful than Zuko. He knew that. But the discipline didn't remind him of his power. It made him very much afraid of it. The focus wasn't on the fact that Ozai was to be a bedrock of truth in Zuko's life. All he learned from that was, my father can shoot fire a lot faster and hotter than I can. Is that what we are supposed to take away from the discipline that comes from God? Keep that in the back of your mind, because a lot of people assume that's the case. Did it give Zuko a greater respect for his elders? Did it demonstrate, as the result of the discipline, that he ought to respect his elders more? Again, no, we don't see that impact being made on Zuko's character. We know another person in his life that gave him a proper example of someone worthy of respect, but the only thing Zuko took away from this was a reminder of the time he was disrespectful, not necessarily a reason to be respectful. And then, of course, and most significantly, did it give him a better example to follow? No. It just gave him a permanent reminder of the time that he did something he shouldn't have. And that's the key. He addressed the behavior, not the individual. And this is what's most important when it comes to understanding discipline. Zuko wasn't punished for the sake of growing, learning, or profiting in any way from the harsh experience. He was punished for punishment's sake. Ozai wasn't doing anything apart from using his power and authority over Zuko to stop the behavior. But on the other hand, did it have anything to do with correcting the course of his life? We look at his uncle and we realize, yeah, that's a lot of much better instruction. We also note a lot better discipline, not in scarring his face, but separating himself from him for a time, not speaking to him, letting him live with the fact that he had severed the relationship. That's discipline. That's godly discipline anyway, because what happens when we separate ourselves from God? We don't feel his nearness anymore. Doesn't mean he's left us. We know exactly where to find him, much like with Uncle Iro. But think about that. God's discipline. Ozai's discipline. Two very different ballparks, wasn't it? So, noting then the actual modeling of the character of God, and I keep mentioning Uncle Iro, but we're here to talk about the Bible, something actually worthwhile. So, Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 3, this is what God's discipline looks like. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself. So the model of Jesus. He endured hostility from people who rejected him. Lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. That'll be important, by the way, the discouragement that comes from constant pestering. You have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. None of us have, right? We fall to sin at any time. We make mistakes. We do the sort of things that warrant discipline from God. But here's the point. Have you forgotten the exhortation, the encouragement, which speaks to you as sons? So if you're the son, he's the father. Note this. My son, this is quoting Proverbs, by the way, do not despise the chastening, the correcting of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure without chastening, notice this. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Therefore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chastened us, as seemed best to them. So notice, it acknowledges they don't always get it right. But in what they understood, what seemed right to them, they corrected. And this is what's the most important point here. But he, notice, contrasted with the fathers, the earthly fathers, who sometimes get it right, he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. The goal of discipline is to make you like him, not to make you less of what you were. Now, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. We'll be getting into it in a few episodes here, but when Zuko finally saw restoration from his uncle, did it mean all the more as a result of the time of separation, the discipline that he allowed on him? How is that any different from God and us? And understand, it's a very interesting point. The greatest security that we have to know that we belong to God. Am I really saved? I really belong to him? Does he let you get away with stuff? Can you go into the sort of things in your life that break his heart, that go against his word, that aren't based on his character? And he'll obviously not be reactive and judge your behavior, but is there no check in your spirit? Is there no sense of distance between you and God? You're just happy all the day despite the things that you're doing. And it's very interesting to note that the greatest security we have as God's children is when he treats us like a father treats his son. That is his discipline. But then you wonder, I don't know, Zuko didn't really seem to be a positive recipient. It seems like if his father was neglectful like Azula, then Ursa would have had a better impact on him overall. He would have been a great person. Well, consider the alternative. And this is what brings Ty Lee up. The reality of our relationship with God includes discipline because that's what it means to be a parent. She never knew if she really had any place in the eyes of her family because she only saw the good things that we enjoy from God. He loves us all the same, right? But without discipline, there is no, pay careful attention, remember Ty Lee's confession by the fire, specific attention given to us, and therefore no active demonstrations for how concerned they are for us as individuals. I was Ty Lee always seeking the attention of all these guys because she had no specific attention and value. And note this, any parent can love their children and give them a home. It takes a father to proactively notice the behavior of their children is leading a wrong direction in life and take the time to correct it. As the author of Hebrews said, it's not fun, but it's the greatest security that we have with God. Because as I stated, consider the alternative. Ty Lee's insecurity drove her to pursue life as a, and I quote, circus freak. Why? She couldn't get her sense of security from her family because there was no discipline. And on the other hand, Zuko only knew his father through the misuse of discipline. And what did it produce? Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4. And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath. What was Zuko's confession again? Nothing but anger and the expression thereof. Bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. He never saw that. Ty Lee never saw that. And what's so interesting is that their identities were established then, not in what is right, but wondering what they did wrong. And that's what brings us to the final point, our desire for God and the impact that our parents have on that. And this, of course, is illustrated by Mai. People both in and outside of the church think that a good Christian is exactly what Mai's impression was of what it meant to be a daughter. Because we're children of God, we're loved, and we're blessed with whatever we want as long as we obey the commandments and behave like good little Christian boys and girls. Does that sound familiar? Not just in the obvious ways, but even in the things that aren't in the Bible. It's just assumed, and note this, that this is your fate. This is just the life that you were born into. You were created to be the good little Christian boy, so that's what you're going to do. And like Mai, what does it produce? Well, unfortunately, this results in forbidding them from even wanting a relationship with God. It's sad, but the soul-crushing pressure that it puts on you, the moment you realize just how much of a sinner you are, completely undoes this picture of what it means to be a child of God that was never even in the Bible anyway. It's interesting, but I want to really emphasize this. When the Bible describes the perfect parent, we're supposed to look at the father. And is it like Mai as the governor's daughter? Or being, and this is also key, the kind of person that is also modeled for us, because we're not just told that our Father in heaven, the ruler of the kings of the earth, the King of kings, the Lord of lords, the Father, who else, as far as the persons of the Godhead are concerned, are we told about? Do we have a relationship modeled there, or is God just the nomad, like Muslims would have us believe, or Jehovah's Witnesses? No, we're also told about the Son. And how did Jesus act? How did Jesus describe his relationship with the Father? The same that we're supposed to have with him as we relate to him as sons. Well, think about this for a second. Not only is the Christian life being like Jesus, but did Jesus ever consider his relationship with the Father as his fate, as an obligation, that if I do what he asks, then he'll bless me, he'll take care of me, he'll give me everything that I want? Meanwhile, I can start, practicing throwing knives, but ultimately just be as soulless and undesired, not wanting anything out of life as a person, than, as Zuko described, unfortunately, his girlfriend or ex. We're not really sure. We are, but noting the point. Is our relationship with God supposed to be like Mai understood it to be the governor's daughter, or is it supposed to be like God the Son? And let me ask you this. How did God the Son see his relationship with his Father? Not just one that he always sought to do the pleasure of, right? But he found it something enjoyable. He found it restful. In the book of Matthew, chapter 11 and verse 26, Jesus, speaking to his Father, said, "Even so, Father, for it seemed good in your sight. All things have been delivered to me by my Father." She's like, oh, so we got a my situation going here? No, note this. No one knows the Son except the Father. There's an intimacy there. Nor does anyone know the Father except the Son. An exclusivity there. And the one to whom the Son wills to reveal him. So, of all the ways that we know and relate to God, who is it through? The Son? Exactly. Now, watch then what that produces. "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden. Weight of the world on your shoulders." No better words to describe mine. "And I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart." See that grace? "And you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." For those who don't understand the reference to a yoke, it's not referring to breakfast, to be lighthearted about it. It's a reference to a harness that was placed on farm animals like oxen. I don't know if it was like Appa or what, but when we're talking about a yoke, it's obviously a tool meant to help you in your work. But as you work, you're going to notice that the kind of creatures that are described as beasts of burden, Appa isn't burdened or inconvenienced by flying. In fact, it's what he was created to do. Nothing gives him more joy. And knowing then that the saddle allows those around him to enjoy it with him, Appa isn't hindered by that. In fact, it equips him to do what he loves to the benefit of others. So when Jesus is describing his yoke, he's not saying your rest means that you no longer work. It means you do the kind of work I actually made you for. Not to be a perfect little boy and girl, but to know who is perfect. No one knows the Father except me. And if we have him, then what do we know? Who do we know? And this is what's most important. There are two ways to relate to anyone, the right and the wrong way. A parent's job is to show which is the better option firsthand. They won't be perfect, but they have the same model that we do as individuals. I can relate to someone for acceptance, and it's a hard journey, or I can relate to them from acceptance. One requires God of me to live up to their expectations, and it gets tiresome. It makes you into my. The other gives God to me, and ultimately makes me accepted on the basis of who I am in him. That's how we relate to God. That is how we find peace. That is how we're supposed to relate to our parents, and ultimately what our parents are supposed to model to us in our relationships with them. Because if, on the other hand, I recognize what would it be like to live forever with the perfect parent. Well, some people hear the word parent, people like Zuko, and think, that's terrible. I don't want to be with Ozai forever. And they get their impression of God from that. And they see life as preparation for an ultimate journey and destination that's not a reward, but a punishment. And so heaven ends up becoming hell. Ty Lee sees an eternity of neglect. The Dante's Inferno Divine Comedy image of just, sitting on a cloud and playing a harp and fitting in line. And then you see people like Mai who look at the life in between and think, I have to spend all of forever doing something that I can barely do in this life anyway. You understand that from the misapplication or the misrepresentation given to them all by their parents, The island definitely brought out what was going on in their hearts, but how did they move on from it? Zula never knew a better option, and so she never chose it. Zuko was given a wrong example. It's only until next week's episode that we'll discuss what a proper example looks like. But then we get to Mai, then we get to Ty Lee. Is that what you really think God wants from you? Is that what you really think is a relationship with God when He Himself describes it as the opposite? You don't earn me, you have me. You've been given me. Now live in light of it. I don't just give you everything that you want. In fact, most of the time, I know what you need and what you don't. I'm not Santa Claus. I pay careful attention to you. I establish your value as worth investing in personally, even in forms of discipline, but not so far as to leave this impression that I'm only here to purge evil, that I want you like me, to be a partaker, and I quote, of my holiness. If that hasn't been the example that your parents have set for you, then I grieve along with you and note as well, the author of Hebrews notes, that's what seems right to them. They will make mistakes. But when it comes to the proper example, do you look to your Heavenly Father, or do you fall into the same trap that the villains of the show up until this point have fallen into, with an improper perspective, a not God perspective towards who He is? Thank you for your time and listening to this study. If you have any sincere questions or want to ask comments, please note that's what they're for. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know what to do. But most importantly, if you know someone who would benefit from hearing this message, please share it with them and help the ministry grow. Thank you for your time. Remember that Jesus loves you and that He is the perfect parent. If we settle for anything less, then we're just setting ourselves up for not good things. God bless you, and I'll see you all again next time.